Question. You said that certain negative emotions make serious work impossible. Does that mean they must be absolutely exterminated before one begins? And what do you mean by serious work? Ouspensky. By serious work I mean not only study, but change. First you must study things, then you work to change them. But since even study cannot go on without a certain change, because there are two processes of study and change which are not fully divided, a more serious study than just at the beginning can already be called serious work. With certain negative emotions, serious work is practically impossible because they will spoil all results. One side of you will work and another side will spoil it. So if you start this work without conquering certain negative emotions, after some time you may find yourself in a worse state than before. It happened several times that people made continuation of work impossible for themselves because they wished to keep their negative emotions. There were moments when they realized it, but they did not make sufficient efforts at the time. And later, the negative emotions became stronger. Question. This is about oneself. But how can we protect ourselves from the negative emotions of others? Ouspensky. Our identification brings us to the negative emotions of other people. It makes us susceptible to them. If you have a definite case, you can visualize the possibility of not being identified, and you will see that you will be less susceptible. But even better than visualizing it is to try it in actual fact. The relation of identification to negative emotions is not a theory. It can be easily verified. Identification is more easy to understand than emotions. There are hundreds of different negative emotions, but identification is always the same. The first step towards non-identification is self-observation. Question. I have been trying to stop the expression of negative emotions in order to struggle with my mechanicalness, but these efforts run down quickly and the need to wake up gets forgotten. Ouspensky. This is because you try it on small emotions. If you try not to express serious emotions, you will keep awake longer. If you remember to struggle with the expression of really strong emotions, at the right moment, you would see the difference. Question. I am puzzled by the question of expressing emotions. If it is beyond ordinary human experience to feel positive emotions, and we are told not to express negative emotions, does that mean we're not to express any emotion whatsoever? Ouspensky. No. It is necessary to navigate between the two. We want to be as emotional as possible, for we miss many perceptions, ideas, understandings, because at the moment we are not emotional. Many perceptions come through emotion. We have no positive emotions, but we can say that we have negative emotions and we have pleasant and unpleasant emotions that are not negative. Question. Positive means not negative? Ouspensky. Yes, and much more besides. An emotion that cannot become negative gives enormous understanding. It has enormous cognitive value. It connects things that cannot be connected in an ordinary state. It is very interesting to see this lack of symmetry between pleasant and unpleasant emotions. Pleasant emotions cannot grow much. They are limited. Unpleasant emotions can grow, but this refers only to our present state of consciousness. In another state, a higher state, the symmetry is re-established, for in a higher state, pleasant emotions can also grow. Of course, we cannot verify this until we are in another state of consciousness. Question. I am asking in connection with right attitudes as a weapon against negative emotions. Does an attitude mean accepting or rejecting? Ouspensky. It is not a question of rejecting. It is a question of understanding. When I speak about right and wrong attitudes in this connection, I mean attitudes to negative emotions in general, and negative emotions in general are subject for conversations about the working of the machine. When you speak about your own observation or your personal work, you must describe which negative emotion you mean: jealousy, fear, anger, and so on. There can be no generalization, because negative emotions are very different and attitudes are different. About one you can say one thing, and about another, another thing. If we take all negative emotions together, they have a certain common quality, but when you speak about your own observations, you must take things on a different scale. Not speak of attitudes, negative emotions, imagination, and identification as though they were abstract things. It is possible to use these terms for the explanation of general features, but you cannot use them when you talk about your own work. We often think we express negative emotions not because we cannot help it, but because we feel we should express them. There's always something deliberate in it. Question. But cannot you be rightly angry if something is wrong? Ouspensky. The most dangerous negative emotions come from the feeling of injustice and indignation. They make you lose more energy, and they are worse if you are right. Question. Why is it worse if you are right? Ouspensky. Because you justify it. If you are wrong, you can see that it is absurd to be angry. Start looking at it from this point of view. Remember that there are very big things that are wrong. We usually identify with small things and forget the big. If we begin to think about the big things, we realize that it is no use identifying with one small thing that is wrong. And one small identifying leads to another small identifying. Question. You said there were many ways of destroying negative emotions. What are they? Ouspensky. First, you must know the negative emotions. You must know in yourself the most important negative emotion, because everybody has a pet one, and you must begin with that. You must know where to begin, and when you know that, you can study practical methods. But when you find negative emotions in yourself, you must understand that the causes are in you and not in other people. They are internal, not external. When you realize that they are in yourself, results will begin to come according to the depth of your conviction and the continuance of your memory. Question. Should we try to discover what it was in us that was demanding expression of a negative emotion? Ouspensky. Very often it is imitation. Somebody else expresses negative emotion, and something in you admires him and thinks, how beautifully he expresses this negative emotion. And then you want to imitate, and you do not know it. Maybe many other things, but very often it is imitation. Question. When you say we must work on fundamental ideas of the system, do you mean like work on negative emotions? Can it be called work if one tries hard to work on oneself in this way? Ouspensky. In any case, whatever you call it, you have got to work on negative emotions, first by studying them, then trying not to express them, then going further and finding your own favorite negative emotion. Suppose somebody has no self-pity, then it is easy for him to work on self-pity. But he may have some other emotion, his own particular one, against which it is difficult to struggle. Generally, one has only a few principal negative emotions. Question. I find it possible to struggle with smaller negative emotions, but sometimes they are too strong and there is an explosion. Ouspensky. Negative emotions are different, and you cannot use the same methods against all of them. In all cases, you must be prepared. It is too late to think when you are already in the negative emotion. You must study identification and be able not to identify. You must be able to think in the right way, not at that moment, but before and after. And you must be able to use negative emotions for self-remembering. But before all that, you must be able to control the manifestation of negative emotions. If you cannot control the manifestation, you cannot start struggling with negative emotions themselves. But you must understand that you can do nothing when you're in the negative emotion. You can only do it before and after. Sometimes, when you're better prepared, you can use them for self-remembering. But that is quite a special thing. In this work, everything can be used. All wrong work of centers can be used. So negative emotions of all kinds can be useful as a help for self-remembering. By that I mean you can train yourself in such a way that negative emotions will remind you of the necessity of remembering yourself. Question. Did you say that the intellectual center could control the emotional center if we knew how? Can you tell us how? Ouspensky. The whole thing is to learn how. Find emotions connected with a certain kind of thinking, with certain points of view. If you acquire new points of view, then after some time the emotion connected with the old points of view will disappear. Many emotions depend on points of view, but it is slow work. Question. Can one always find one's chief negative emotion, or only sometimes? Ouspensky. One can if one is sincere about it. It is a question of sincerity and of a certain effort, but we do not want to make this effort, so we rarely do. Even if we decide to look for our negative emotions, we concentrate on small emotions. We're never sincere enough to admit what our chief negative emotion is, because sometimes it looks ugly. When I said that it's necessary to find one's chief negative emotions, I meant not the most important, but the most persistent. If you find them and try to work on them, it often helps to see against what other emotions you can struggle. There are usually 2 or 3 you can struggle with. But you must be more precise and not just talk about emotions in general. General talk about emotions is good for general thinking, but not for action. You can act only in relation to definite facts. Question. Are not the most dangerous negative emotions jealousy, fear, hate, anger? Ouspensky. No, this is a wrong classification. The most useful classification is by the degree of identification, for that is what does the most harm. You take these as negative emotions of the first degree, but it is not necessarily true. For some people, self-pity is the worst. For another person, the worst thing may be the feeling of injustice. You never know which is worse, because it depends on identification and on features. Since the capacity to feel certain emotions particularly strongly and to identify with them may be the chief feature of false personality. It is different for different people. Question. Which negative emotions does one have to transform? Ouspensky. All of them. One must first begin with those one can tackle, and then pass to more difficult and still more difficult, if it is possible. Negative emotions are in an intermediate state between sanity and insanity. A man whose center of gravity is in negative emotions cannot be called sane. He must become normal first. Negative emotions must be divided into 3 categories. First, the more usual, more ordinary, everyday emotions. You must observe them and must already have a certain control over their expression. When you have acquired a certain control of non-expression of these negative emotions, The question comes as how to deal with the emotions themselves. You must start dealing with them by trying not to identify as often and as much as you can, for they are always connected with identification. And if you conquer identification, they disappear. The second category of emotions do not appear every day. They are the more difficult, more complex emotions, depending on some mental process, such as suspicion, hurt feelings, and many things like that. They are harder to conquer. You can deal with them by creating a right mental attitude, by thinking, not at the time, but in between when you're quiet. Try to find the right attitude, the right point of view, and make it permanent. If you create right thinking, this will take all power from these negative emotions. Then there is the third category, much more intense, much more difficult, and rare. Against them you can do nothing. These two methods of struggling with identification and of creating right attitudes do not help. When such emotions come, you can do only one thing. You must try to remember yourself. That is, remember yourself with the help of the emotion. If you learn to use these emotions for self-remembering, they may diminish and disappear after some time. But for this, you have to be prepared. At present, since you do not know which emotion belongs to which category, you must try to use all three methods for all of them. But later you will see that they are divided into these categories, and in one case one thing helps, in another case another thing. And in all cases you must be prepared. As I said in the beginning, it will be difficult to struggle with them or conquer them, but you will learn through time. Only never mix emotions with the expression of negative emotions. That always comes first. As long as you cannot stop the expression of negative emotions, it means that you can do nothing about the emotions themselves. So before you can do anything else, you must learn to control their manifestation. If you learn to control this manifestation, then you can start. Question. With one's habitual negative emotions, is it some particular feature in oneself that always brings them? Ouspensky. Quite possibly. But if you practice not identifying, you will see that. You identify with many, many things, not only with negative emotions. From morning till night you pass from one identification to another. But when you try more than usual not to identify, you may notice many negative emotions you have not seen before. Some you may see full size, or others you may only notice their tails disappearing. If you try noticing and not identifying, it will make you stronger in dealing with negative emotions. Question. Did you say that negative emotions would be useful if we could be not identified with them? Ouspensky. If we could be not identified, we would have different results. That would help very definitely, since it would give orientation to life and many other things we do not know yet. I said if we could not identify, they would be very useful functions. As they are, negative emotions are not useful. All negative emotions that we cannot avoid become useful functions if we use them for self-remembering. Some people manage to do that and get two things at once: elimination of the negative emotion and creation of self-remembering. If you have a persistent negative emotion, and by right thinking you connect it with self-remembering, then after some time it will help self-remembering. And after some more time, if you persist, the negative emotion will disappear. So they can serve a useful purpose if you can use them. But if you identify with them, they are no good at all.